thanks very much, and I'm sure whenever people arrive here, they say how happy they are to be here, but considering that I just got back late last night from the Middle East, and a few days ago was getting death threats in Bahrain, considering the alternatives, boy, I'm glad to be here. Now, we're going to try to talk, sort of combine a little bit about half the sky and a little bit about the Middle East. It is going to be sort of roughly a quarter of the sky and maybe half of the Middle East or so. But let me just start off by talking a little bit about the question of how it is that I ended up writing so much about women around the world. It's obviously a little bit unusual for a New York Times op-ed columnist to be looking at this so much. And as you may know, the expression half the sky comes from a Chinese expression, and really the awakening for us intellectually came when my wife and I were reporters in China. That's Cheryl and me in Tiananmen Square a few months ago, and just checking how awake you are, how your vision is. Actually, one way of kind of giving away how long ago that was that our eldest son, who is on my shoulders there, he just graduated from high school last June, which really only goes to show how quickly kids will grow in just a few months. But when we were in China, we began to see what happens when a society does invest in girls' education and bringing women into the formal economy. Another theme, though, is maybe a happier one. And it is that if you put aside all the wretched things that are happening to women and girls around the world, you put aside the injustices and just look at the pragmatic question of how one can make a difference, but how one can most effectively address global poverty, global insecurity, climate change, so many other issues around the globe, then in many cases, the most cost-effective intervention you can have is to focus on women and girls and try to unleash the same kind of a virtuous cycle that we talked about in the case of Hubei province with Daimanju, and replicate that kind of a cycle of change. Put it another way, women and girls aren't the problem, they're the solution. And let me just take a brief diversion now and talk a little bit about the Middle East, maybe because it is so much on my mind, having just returned and having been covering it so much over the last 6 weeks or so. One of the striking changes in this issue is that traditionally the people who raised issues of fair treatment of women and girls or getting more girls in school were humanitarians, do-gooders who believed deeply in this issue. And they never got very much traction because the issue that we tend to care about is national security. Well, especially post 9/11 and especially in Afghanistan, it became clear that one of the best metrics for whether a given district in Afghanistan was more secure was whether there were more girls going to school in that district. And so to me, one of the most striking changes over the last 5 years or so has been the degree to which the Pentagon has become an advocate of girls' education and empowering women and girls. And one moment in Afghanistan, you'll hear a hard-bitten American general talk about airstrikes, and the next moment he'll talk about the importance of getting more girls in school. And that is a change in psychology and a voice in favor of female empowerment that I think is giving the issue much more traction. And if I try to think about how one can make the Middle East more secure and what one can do over the longer term to generate a region that is going to be more hospitable to democracy, then I think there are a couple of reasons for focusing on investments in girls' education and bringing women into the labor force. One has to do with population dynamics, and this seems kind of a neat thing to say at a university, but the single factor that seems to be most destabilizing in a society is the proportion of the population aged 15 to 24. The bigger the share of that population that you have of that youth bulge, the more likely you are to have civil war, terrorism, civil conflict. And in effect, then, the way you reduce that youth bulge is you reduce birth rates. And the way you do that is you educate girls and bring them into the labor force. And one reason, I think, that so much of the Middle East has been so torn apart by wars is they have this huge youth bulge. And they have that huge youth bulge because women have been so marginalized. And another factor that we don't fully understand, but it does seem that societies where that are completely male-dominated tend to acquire kind of an ethos of a military barracks, of a prison, tend to be kind of violent subcultures. And some American sociologists think that the American West was so violent for that reason. There was this society driven by young men. And, Afghanistan today, for that matter, Libya today, has some of that same kind of ethos. You educate girls, bring those women into the labor force, and you can really see some transformations. If you look at Pakistan versus Bangladesh, and of course they both used to be part of the same country, they split apart in 1971. One reason Bangladesh is not on our radar screen as a threat is they did a phenomenal job of educating girls. And today in Bangladesh, there are actually more girls in high school than there are boys. And the upshot was that all those educated girls formed the basis for an amazing civil society and for a garment industry that then led to foreign exchange being brought into an economy that has been growing. And I think that has to be one of our issues on our agenda in our own self-interest in building a Middle East. When Cheryl and I were writing Half the Sky, we also looked at various American groups who started some effort to support education or support maternal health abroad. And typically, when they got involved, they initially thought, I've got a million things to do, there's so many causes to get engaged in, this is going to be a burden. But, okay, it's a good cause, and I'll do it. And invariably, they found that, especially when it's more than just check writing, they really got engaged, that it became completely empowering of themselves. And maybe started off thinking they're going to be empowering girls in Ugandan villages, but they ended up really empowering and improving themselves. And the truth is that at the end of the day, our efforts to help other people have a somewhat mixed record. They've got an almost perfect record of helping ourselves. And I think that's wisdom that we've also seen in social psychology. There's been increasing work in social psychology, neurology, and economics about what makes us happy. And the lessons are very complex, but one of the lessons is that one of the ways to raise our base level of happiness is to connect to some cause larger than ourselves that provides a measure of fulfillment and satisfaction. And so especially for those who are students, I think that if you can find some cause that you believe in that is bigger than yourself, that can be a hugely important pillar of your life alongside your career, alongside your family, that gives it meaning. And it also gives you perspective.